Oh, okay. So on behalf of Tibet Museum of Department of Information and International Relation of Central Tibetan Administration, I would like to welcome all of you to the Tibet Museum's monthly Tibet Awareness Talk Series. And today, indeed, I'm very honored and to have with us the speaker, Dr. Natalie Avalos. And Dr. Natalie Avalos will talk on the topic settler colonialism, putting Native American and Tibetan dispossession in conversation. So before starting the Dr. Nathalie's presentation, I would like to give a brief introduction about the speaker. So Natalie Avalos is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's an ethnographer of religion whose teaching and research explores the religious dimensions of transnational Native American and Tibetan sovereignty. She received her PhD in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara with a special focus on Native American and indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism. So, in her ethnographic research with the Tibetan refugee community, she is interested in interlinking religio-political foundations of Tibetan identity and belonging in diaspora, such as building sacred relationships to land through ritual, collective Buddhist practice, and the Lagar movement. So with this, I've done a short introduction about the guest speaker. So without much taking time, I would like to request Dr. Natala to kindly commence today's session. Thank you so much.
You all hear me okay? Okay, good. So today's talk is based on my book manuscript I'm currently writing called Decolonizing Metaphysics, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal. I essentially was brought to this work because as someone that has Mexican American ancestry, you can see I have Native ancestry too. Well, when the picture pops back up, you'll see it. It's a picture of my grandparents. But as someone that became dispossessed by colonialism generations ago, and then I also became a Buddhist in my 20s, I was really interested in the parallels between Native and Tibetan people and how they had similar experiences, how state policies actually were quite similar in the ways that they often persecuted religious life. So an opinion piece published last fall in the New York Times titled "The 1 Million Tibetan Children in China's Boarding Schools" describes how China has brought in its boarding school program to children as young as 4 and 5 years old. The author, Tibetan scholar, and activist Gyal Lo describes how his brother reached out to him in distress. His granddaughters had become estranged from their Tibetan identities within months of attending this school. They're less interested in participating in Buddhist traditions on their weekend visits home. They reject Tibetan foods. They speak Tibetan less frequently. China shut down local schools in the northeast region of Tibet where they live. Boarding schools far from home were generally the only option for education. When you refuse to send your children to these schools, it leaves you open to becoming blacklisted and persecuted in other ways. Lola explains that China has strategically used education as a political tool for 70 plus years in its struggle to legitimate its control over Tibet. First banning the Tibetan language and then developing military-style residential schools in 1985 to assimilate Tibetans into, quote, Chinese subjects, Chinese Communist Party loyalists, model subjects easy to control and manipulate, he says. 80% of school-aged Tibetan children are currently attending these schools. Lowell notes that the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, recently announced visa restrictions would be imposed on Chinese officials involved in this kind of coercive schooling. Lowe hopes that Canada and Australia might follow suit, given their own history of colonial boarding schools. The U.S. ended its official Indian boarding school program in 1969. Various forms of compulsory schooling were developed in the U.S. to civilize Native people, initially through missionary efforts in the 1600s, later expanding into military-style boarding schools facilitated by state and missionary officials in the 1800s. Native American religious traditions were officially banned by the state in 1883 through the Religious Crimes Code. State discourse claims that banning Native religion would aid in civilizing Indians, assimilating them into white Christian life ways, replete with nuclear families, individual property ownership. They sought to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. The true reasons for doing this were actually much more complex. Federal agents and missionaries targeted medicine men, basically Native American religious leaders, because they saw them as a corrupting force in the community. Ceremonies were thought to make Native men more warlike and thus more difficult to control. Worse, these ceremonies reinforced community cohesion and commitments to their identity as stewards of land. The idea that land was full of relatives versus resources was anathema to the manufactured scarcity that European settlers promoted in their system of capitalism. Religious leaders were often jailed or even executed, leaving many tribes devoid of traditional leadership and spiritual guidance. Such bans would not be lifted until 1934, and the government failed to enact protections for Native people until the Native American Religious Freedom Act of 1978. What is obvious now is that state actors were terrified of the spiritual power held in Native leadership. It threatened not only Christian worldviews, but also their monopoly on religio-political power. In Tibet, the People's Republic of China framed its invasion and subsequent takeover as a form of liberation that would civilize and free Tibetans from oppressive theocratic rule. While seemingly benevolent, this discourse objectified Tibetan people. It treated them as if they were devoid of agency to make their own socio-political decisions. By framing Tibetan lifeways, characterized by a system of aristocracy, monasteries, and peasant communities as in need of intervention, they borrowed from the Western playbook of imperial power. It relied upon the discourse of modern versus primitive to dispossess people of their lands and autonomy. China destroyed monasteries and imprisoned monks and nuns during its long invasion of Tibet in the 1950s, banning religious life altogether at the start of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Tibetans would experience famine, inflation, the loss and privatization of their lands, economic polarization, as well as environmental and spiritual pollution. For the People's Republic of China, civilizing Tibetans meant eliminating their religion and replacing it with a new dogma of communism and secularity. For many Tibetans I spoke to, the loss of religious freedom was the most egregious harm. Some recounted hiding an image of the Dalai Lama with the butter lamp in a small closet, but they lived in constant fear of being caught and imprisoned. Tibetan identity is essentially criminalized and constrained here. Monastics noted that modern conventions like the nation state often served people with power versus everyday people. Worse, the secular skepticism that denied karma and reincarnation, deities and spirits, undermined ethics and created obstacles to maintaining a proper relationship between humans and the non-human realms, which was necessary for human flourishing. Like the 19th century U.S. government, the PRC was keenly aware that Tibetan religious and political life was tethered. By framing Tibetan religion as primitive and Tibetan culture as in need of modern development, this framework was already legible to Western powers and used regularly by the US in places like the Middle East and Latin America through the 20th century. What is also likely is that the spiritual power wielded by Tibetans' enlightened leadership was a threat to the PRC's agenda. While we assume modernity is a collective good, decolonial scholars have argued that modernity has generally only benefited imperialist powers. Thus, modernity is really just a globalized form of colonialism. We can understand civilizing missions in the US and Tibet as a form of native elimination, which is the principal aim of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is an anthropological idea that was first theorized by scholars like Patrick Wolf, who describes them as a system that destroys to replace, meaning life in the territory desired is thoroughly transformed through various logics of elimination that wage genocide over time. Native populations lose political autonomy, land title, primarily through a grammar of race. They are converted or re-socialized by the settler state, becoming refugees in their own lands. The U.S. model of native elimination through religious criminalization, warfare, racialization, and apartheid has shaped similar projects enacted around the globe, principally China's in Tibet. The critical link here is the role of religion as both the primary site of dispossession, but also potentially of liberation. Both Native and Tibetan peoples have faced imprisonment and re-education in the hopes that they would abandon their religious worlds. However, they have refused. I draw on Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson's work, which describes how Mohawk peoples have refused U.S. Canadian structures of sovereignty imposed upon them. She theorizes refusal as a way to reject statist forms of citizenship that seek to eliminate your own claims to sovereignty. In my research with Native and Tibetan peoples, retaining your identity, who you are in the world, means retaining your religious life. While religious life is the foundation for survivance, or what some scholars call the interlinked motion of survival and resistance, its lived practice ultimately extends much further than any singular experience of the sacred. It is embedded in identity, culture, community. This point came up often in the field, which took place in New Mexico between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. For Native people who have lived under occupation for 200 and 300 years, they knew who they were despite this cultural impediment. Knowing who they were was a source of strength and pride. One of my interlocutors, Gregory Gomez, who is Lipan and Mescalero Apache, illustrates this as follows. He says, "We grew up with our culture. We grew up with our traditions, with our stories, our songs. We grew up doing ranch work, farm work. It gave us a different kind of education," he says. Gregory notes that Apache territories exist beyond state and federal borders. The question of transnationalism is apparent here because 2/3 or 7 out of 10 Native people live in urban areas away from their home nations or territories. They are popularly perceived as being fully assimilated into the American project. However, as Gregory explains, many persist as Native peoples despite this. They navigate traditional knowledge and kin on their own terms. For Tibetan people in the US, living so far from home was a source of profound grief. While there was a sense of relief that they could build more financial autonomy in ways that were more difficult in Tibet or in Nepal and India, there was a clear effort to retain Tibetanness in diaspora. For Tibetans, this fundamentally means remaining a Buddhist. One woman that I spoke to, called Kedoma, says she was raised in Tibet. She was born in Tibet, raised in Nepal, later came to the US as a refugee. She says it's critical to know your culture, given the ethnic cleansing that Tibetans are experiencing in Tibet. She says, as a Tibetan, we live outside of Tibet. If we don't know the culture, we're going to get lost. The Chinese in Tibet try and teach everything in Chinese. When Tibetans go to school, they're learning in Chinese. If we don't preserve it, it might get lost. Here in Santa Fe, all the kids in the summer have 3 months vacation. We hire a Tibetan dance teacher so that they learn Tibetan music, dance, instruments, everything during the summer. For those facing structural elimination, knowing who you are, your language, your traditions, your songs is critical. Your sense of identity is dependent because this is also where your ethics reside. These are the views specific to you and your people. If they are lost, the fear is that you will be too. While Tibetans were not traditionally invested in nationalism, life in diaspora is quite intentionally dedicated to religious practice as cultural preservation, and in this sense becomes a kind of transnational assertion of sovereignty. These refusals to assimilate or submit to coercive power illustrate how Native and Tibetan peoples are fighting a unique yet parallel struggle against ethnic cleansing, but also invisibility. One of the most profound tools of colonial power is its ability to not only control lands and resources, but also the narrative. This is where decolonization as an analytic is key. Decolonization is synonymous with liberation. Historically, it is a geopolitical project that seeks for those colonized nations to be fully independent, fully sovereign. It's also understood as a form of praxis that dismantles empire, meaning all the forms of practices and ideas that contribute to these ends. In this sense, decolonization seeks to dismantle colonialism by enacting new ways of living and being autonomous as peoples in a world beyond empire. For indigenous and colonized peoples, decolonization is often about making the asymmetrical relations of power visible. For instance, the simple binary that still continues to divide people as either civilized or primitive. As Edward Said has noted, this determination is a self-serving one that sought to convince the West of its own superiority and the rest of its inferiority. Contemporary biological data tells us that race, in the form of phenotypic difference, has no biological reality. These assumptions of superiority and inferiority only remain because they serve power. The more we collectively challenge these assumptions, the less power they hold. Ultimately, decolonization is about affirming your humanity after centuries of lies, misinformation, and dehumanization. For indigenous peoples, colonial dispossession is more than loss of land and political autonomy. It's epistemic. It attacks your knowledge system. Racism is not just an ideology, it becomes a worldview. Ultimately, its aim is to determine who is rightfully sovereign and who is not. In a contemporary context, indigeneity as a category denotes familial and historic relations as well as ways of being in the world, both of which rest on metaphysical claims, a sacred connection to the living world and its inhabitants. This is why, in a Native context, decolonization is often described as returning to a Native worldview. In this sense, liberation for Native people relies on a transformed experience and comprehension of oneself in relation to a greater reality. The foundation of indigenous religious life consists of maintaining an individual and collective relationship to spiritual power residing in land. Understanding that this larger spiritual power is engaged through prayer and ceremony, human persons are called upon to be stewards of land, responsible to protect and nurture it, since the land provides the material and spiritual needs of the people. Settler colonialism has disrupted these systems. It has redefined land from a place of relatives to one of resources. This is what Aboriginal scholar Eileen Moreton Robinson calls the white possessive. In a colonial context, she says race, in this case whiteness, operates as an ontological signifier that lays claim to land and political and economic power. She argues it is the nature of the people's relationship to land that actually signifies its true legitimacy, meaning that for Native people, it is their intersubjective ontologies that actually makes them sovereign. She says, our ontological relationship to land is a condition of our embodied subjectivity. The indigenous body signifies our land title. Our death reintegrates our body with that of our mother, the earth. In this way, Aboriginal people understand themselves as land. They return to it after their death, and in this sense, this is their connection to title. This is their connection to sovereignty. For Moreton Robinson, settler dispossession does not and can never erase Indigenous claims to land. It suggests that Indigenous subjectivity is processual, and it represents a dialectical unity between humans and the land. It is a state of embodiment that continues to unsettle white Australia, she says. So when we compare Native and Tibetan colonialisms, we also make visible how forms of sovereignty are conceptualized in ways that actually exceed and even challenge the legitimacy of Westphalian nation states. Tibetans also have land-based religious traditions. They often identify themselves as people from the land of snows. Their epithet for Tibet, referring to Tibetan as a people of place would not be an overstatement. Tibetan identity is generally, and I'll show this slide, Tibetan identity is embedded in lands through relationships with the world of deities, places of life essence, La, Rene. These land-based spiritual powers, used by human oracles and other ritual specialists, are understood to reside in the soil, mountains, passes, cliffs, lakes. Tibetans maintain good relationships with these deities, whether they're La or Sen. They're associated with their individual clans or village. They made daily offerings of juniper because they believed that their health and well-being were coextensive, they were connected. In this sense, these relationships were binding due to an ethical sense of mutuality. These land-based traditions coexist with transmundane forms of power mediated by Buddhist ritual and cosmology. Although Buddhist or Indian cosmologies have informed and shaped Tibetan ones, their layers are variously meaningful to lay people, scholars, and even religious leaders. Given this perspective, maintaining relationships to place and the spiritual power within it constituted a major component of Tibetan identity, but also political agency. Navigating this in diaspora has been more difficult. A Tibetan man that I spoke to, Jamyang, admits he doesn't have a special relationship to Tibetan land because he had never been there, but that this link remains very real for the older generation. He says, the generation of my parents, the older generation, they absolutely have this relationship. They have a strong relation to the soil and the land. Much of the land-based dimensions of the religious life, such as daily offerings to local deities or pilgrimages to sacred mountains, have been replaced with a focus on Buddhist ritual and diaspora. While this dimension of their religious life continues in some ways, to some degrees, another major component of it, the piece that roots them deeply in their land, is compromised through colonialism, leaving them and their lands vulnerable to ontological harm. Ontological harm here is understood as both a kind of trauma and metaphysical dispossession. It sits at the intersection of soul loss and historical trauma. The concept of historical trauma was initially developed through clinical observations of survivors of the Holocaust. They were trying to understand why adverse psychological effects such as depression, self-destructive behavior, anger, elevated mortality rates continued to persist among descendants over generations. Historical trauma is now used to understand the specific kind of trauma that was experienced by Native Americans. It is aggravated by the minimization and even the denial of Native genocide and its impact on Native people. This loss is complex for Native and Indigenous peoples because it denotes the loss of land in addition to culture. Researchers found that the loss of sacred lands in religious life is also a major source of grief. Historical trauma provides a framework for understanding how boarding schools, coerced conversion, and missionization put Native Americans at a higher risk for intergenerational mental health problems. Native and Indigenous people are also socially invisibilized above being permanently othered in a society that favors whiteness. The everyday experiences of living in a society that is hostile or demeaning due to the stigma of racialization makes these effects cumulative. Similarly, Tibetan peoples in Tibet are socially invisibilized and permanently othered in a society that favors Han Chinese identity. Historical trauma may also apply to them, given the ways it understands the loss of political autonomy, religious freedom, and dispossession from lands is a major factor. Native American people in the U.S. began to combat this loss through the Red Power movement starting in the 1960s. This movement continues to today. It's driven by reassertions of Native identity and lifeways, Red Power reclamations of language, culture, and traditions were boldly defying, at this time, Native religious traditions were still outlawed, so they were boldly defying the status quo. In this sense, Native people were posing a political threat by refusing assimilation. We now commonly understand that this insurgent strategy for survival is also a form of decolonial praxis. Decolonization not only seeks to dismantle settler states and the harmful asymmetrical power within it, it also seeks to assert lifeways that are your own in the face of assimilation and white supremacy. While the Red Power movement was inspired by some other nationalist movements, Black and Brown, Native people were primarily focused on their treaty rights and asserting their sovereignty as members of Native nations instead of having civil rights as ethnic minorities. Something similar since 2008 through the Lakar or White Wednesdays movement. On Wednesdays, they eat Tibetan food, wear Tibetan clothes, speak Tibetan language, and casually do Tibetan things like circumambulate Patala Palace and Lhasa. For peoples whose religious life was expressly outlawed, these everyday assertions of identity pose a potent yet still legal challenge to PRC efforts to ethnically cleanse Tibetans. Even more compelling, Tibetans in diaspora began observing Lakar in solidarity, posting pics over social media as a form of external support. In an increasingly global world, liberation movements are necessarily engaged in transnational discourse. They shape and inspire one another. At a workshop I recently attended at Notre Dame, A scholar, Dalia Fahmy, is an international expert on democratization, Islamophobia, the author of Arab Spring, Modernity, Identity, and Change. She remarked that a series of self-immolations by Tibetans inspired the Arab Spring. I suspected there was a connection, but she affirmed it. In 2008, Tibetans inside and outside of Tibet held massive protests against the Olympics being held in Beijing. The protests within Tibet were wide, sweeping, and bold. China responded with a violent crackdown. More than 1,000 monks and lay people were disappeared. In February 2009, a Tibetan monk self-immolated in protest. Soon, lay Tibetans followed. On December 17, 2010, a Tunisian fruit vendor self-immolated in protest over economic marginalization and police harassment, galvanizing Tunisians to rise up against oppressive conditions. The self-immolations by Tibetans in Tibet and in diaspora would grow to 100 by the end of 2012, the year I began this research. The Occupy Wall Street movement had begun at the very end of 2011. It was also inspired by the Arab Spring. On the ground, many native and indigenous peoples began to support this impulse to protest, but they were critical of the colonial discourse of occupation. While some resisted this narrative, others began to see that the U.S.'s long history of dispossessing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color was now being directed at everyday Americans. Albuquerque's Occupy movement would soon split into two over this difference in opinion. There was an offshoot led by Native peoples called Unoccupy, and it had clear decolonial aims. In other words, it explicitly called for the dismantling of the U.S. as an imperial settler state. At the end of 2012, First Nations people in Canada would build on the many decolonial offshoots of Occupy, such as Decolonize Oakland, which is pictured here, and Deoccupy Hawaii. They started the I Don't Know More movement. Hundreds of indigenous people gathered at malls and other public places to round dance in protest of the abuse of their treaty rights. This elegant expression of religion as protest sought to visibilize the forms of elimination that Native peoples were still experiencing. They were soon joined by thousands of indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, showing support over social media, holding round dances of their own, first in Canada and then in the U.S. Eventually, these forms of protest and support were visible through social media around the world. I attended one such round dance at a mall in Albuquerque in 2012. I snapped this photo of a young Native boy holding a sign that said, "I support I Don't Know More." Other signs simply read, "Decolonize." This movement would pave the way for more Indigenous-led protests around treaty rights and land protection. The largest was Standing Rock in 2016. In his Returns Becoming Indigenous, scholar James Clifford notes that the decentering of political economic power in a global age creates space for the reemergence of Indigenous visibility and claims. This global expression of Indigenous resistance acts as a placeholder for diverse yet parallel sociopolitical goals. Social media has aided these goals, providing Indigenous and other colonized peoples with a platform to speak to one another, educate the public, and build deep affinities. Increasingly, it unites the dispossessed in their overlapping movements for structural change. The shifting relations of power catalyzed by Tibetan self-immolations described above ultimately reshaped grassroots protest. These forms of protest continue to morph and change, but at heart, they illuminate injustice and demand ethical action. It begs the question, are Tibetans indigenous? Can they connect with indigenous movements? This is an idea that has been hotly debated in the Tibetan community, right? The category of indigeneity is fraught. It's both an identity and a legal category. The UN defines indigenous peoples as peoples and nations having historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories. In this sense, it's an identity born out of racialization and violence. While the boundaries of indigeneity are contested, this category remains flexible enough for multiple iterations of indigenous identity. Tibetans do fit the UN definition. Much like the US Native relations, the PRC claimed Tibetans were not civilized enough to be politically sovereign and needed their help assimilating to a modern world. Although Tibetans were initially ambivalent about identifying as indigenous, there is a new generation of Tibetan scholars and community workers who are reframing Tibet's occupation as a form of settler colonialism and exploring the value of claiming indigeneity. Tibetan anthropologist Dawa Lokiksan explains that the question of Tibetan indigeneity needn't be answered definitively. What matters more is actually that this claim links Tibetan struggles for sovereignty to other indigenous movements, becoming a decolonial tool. In this sense, claiming indigeneity makes Tibetan elimination visible on the global stage to states that may intervene, but more importantly, to other dispossessed peoples who may offer solidarity in the struggle. Lokitsang began raising the question of Tibetan indigeneity more publicly in a now influential blog that she started with a group of Tibetans in 2011 called Lakar Diaries. The links that connect us here are many. So why compare Native and Tibetan colonial forms of dispossession? We know indigenous peoples are already in conversation, learning from and inspiring one another. Why search for patterns or connections across peoples? Ultimately, it may visibilize what may not otherwise be seen. A trans-indigenous approach to Native and Tibetan movements for sovereignty does not assume that their experiences are perfectly symmetrical, but it does reveal aspects of their resistance that would remain marginalized or omitted altogether due to disciplinary divisions, such as how the logics of elimination developed in the West become operationalized by China in the East, or how religious dispossession produces distinct forms of trauma and loss. Importantly, a global indigenous comparison of Tibetan and U.S. Native movements helps us see the religious forms of resistance that exist beyond normative forms of protest, suggesting that both act as decolonial praxis. Transnational Native and Tibetan refusal is generative. Their refusal to abandon their religious lifeways, their lived epistemologies, and ways of being positions their religious worlds as a rehumanizing set of counter-discourses and practices that affirm their humanity and also their sovereignty. In this sense, this refusal is healing, but also decolonizing. In the field, I learned that the forms of resistance I was familiar with, such as grassroots organizing, protests, marches, and community building, were actually rooted in less visible forms, religious epiphanies, and forms of practice that took place internally and influenced how people were able to live on their own and collective terms in the face of ongoing dispossession. By asserting their religious lifeways transnationally, Native and Tibetan peoples ultimately refused to be racialized. They refused to believe the lies that their knowledge is inferior in any way, or that their claims to land and sovereignty are illegitimate. In other words, both movements act as an ethical clarion call. They're a clarion call to a globalized world desperate for a new set of ethics and life ways beyond the dehumanizing forces of empire. Thank you.
You said it, but it was so quick and then I didn't pick it up fully. Do you have some of the legal, like when do you legally can name someone indigenous, or what are the like categories?
Yeah, what is the legal category?
Yeah.
So the UN defines it as people that are essentially first peoples that inhabited lands that are now taken over by others. But indigenous peoples also define themselves as people that have sacred and interdependent relationships with land, so that understand themselves as actually are living embedded in land, and that see personhood all around them. And so that's a more broadened definition. So when indigenous peoples first started agitating at the UN level, this was 1977, they were deciding among themselves who was included in this category of indigenous. And partly it was through these two definitions, both were you living in a state where you had become dispossessed of your land and political autonomy, and do you have a sacred interdependent relationship with land? Yeah. And so in this sense, Tibetans can sort of fit the category, but not perfectly. But again, as some young Tibetan activists and scholars have said, you don't have to fit the category perfectly, because maybe the goal is just to add visibility and to leverage that as a way to bring more awareness and solidarity, especially because indigenous movements have been growing and they become so much more powerful globally in the last 5-10 years. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you said it like that. You spoke about decolonization as an analytical tool.
Yes.
Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so we can think of decolonization as both a geopolitical project, and that's generally how it was defined in the mid-20th century. When states like India, for instance, and other states in the Middle East and Asia, many states in Africa, for instance, became independent of colonial rule, that was considered an example of decolonization. But theorists at that time also began to talk about how colonialism transformed culture, and it transformed your relationship to one another. And it actually shaped your psychology in the sense that you have internalized maybe ideas that you were inferior, right? So you may have internalized an inferiority complex. You may have internalized this idea that only Western state systems are the only legitimate systems. And so many anti-colonial and decolonial theorists began to say, well, decolonization is also has to operate psychologically. It has to operate. Exactly. And that part of decolonization is healing from all of these ideologies that were essentially created to objectify you and marginalize you. And how is it that we may still be living with the legacy of all of these ideas, right? How does it define our goals in terms of education, our goals in terms of even beauty standards, right? Our goals of how we think state governments should be run and why. And it's become a key analytic in Indigenous studies and among Indigenous people, because for them, they understand that the land itself is sovereign. They understand that they become sovereign through their stewardship and care of land. And so it's a very different state model. It's a very different model of like nationalism, And so I think ultimately it challenges the idea that there's only one potential model to exist in terms of states and nations. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Even in India, when they dig up the dams
Mhm.
to make dams, which is sustainable, but you have to dig the river underwater. And a lot of cultures that live with the river make the offerings and the
Yeah.
land, they suddenly just lose the connection.
Right. And that when we disrupt relationships to land, right, that becomes a kind of harm, right? And so, yeah, decolonization has been framed even as, when you revitalize your language, when you revitalize your traditions, you restore a sense of pride in your community. So it can mean a lot of things, but is generally directed towards self-determination. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be interested here to see in Dharamshala and amongst Tibetans using the word colonization
Yeah.
by Han Chinese,
Mhm.
because in the West, we're always taught that it's a white colonization of
Yeah.
black people, African,
Right.
Asia, and the world really at one
Right.
time in history.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting now shift in the word and I think it's very challenging
Mhm.
to probably the left in Western countries that
Yeah.
have always kind of framed their politics and their ideas of colonization as being by white people against indigenous people.
Yeah.
And now we've got people who are not white
Yeah.
colonizing, like Chinese
Yeah.
Han people
Yeah.
colonizing Mongolia,
Yeah. Yeah.
Turkestan,
And
Tibet, Hong
it
Kong,
challenges
etc.
your model of what you think imperialism is, right?
Yeah,
Continue there, because this is imperialism,
Totally.
evident in the millenniums,
Yeah.
different. This is not new, is it?
It's not new, but this particular system of colonialism is part of what has shaped modernity. And so we see them as connected in the sense that these contemporary forms, even though there's a history, part of human struggle is always around violence and dispossession, right? How do we maintain our autonomy and maintain community? So it's a long human story, but these forms of imperialism are decidedly contemporary in their structures, in their mechanisms. And so when I was first, proposing this work in my Buddhist studies program, many of my colleagues said, well, no, that colonialism only exists among European powers. It doesn't exist in Asia. But I think we have to challenge that idea, right? That if anything, the US became the model for how to mete out. I mean, honestly, if we even look at the history of Nazi Germany, they were borrowing some of the same systems of the reservation system essentially became concentration camps for Jews. So these same systems are used by other countries, and they've been used through the 20th century. They're continuing to be used in places like Israel and Palestine. So we really have to challenge our assumptions, and it can be difficult to do that, but I think it's productive for us to do because it helps us see part of what is difficult about challenging this level of power is that it can become so invisibilized. So part of the goal is actually to help us illuminate how these strategies of power are operating, how they're operating through racialization and through these normative claims of primitiveness, right? That even though I think a lot of people in the West would say, oh, we no longer think of Native Americans as primitive, they would reject that idea. But somehow this discourse of primitive is still actively legitimized around the world, right? And so until we actively challenge it, then it will still have power. And I think that's really the goal.
So a lot of scholars believe that settler colonialism is an evolutionary process, right? Since we are living in a digital world, China is probably going to be the most powerful country to have control over AI. artificial intelligence. How do you imagine China as a colonial power in the future that you're living right now? And what kind of new challenges do you see for indigenous, particularly Tibetans?
That's a really good question. You know, in terms of settler colonialism being an evolutionary system, I don't necessarily think that it is. I think that, if anything, it became an acceptable model, partly because that's how the West was created. You know, the whole Western region of the world was all indigenous, you know, all through the Americas. But what's interesting is that you actually still have a fair number of indigenous peoples in Latin America and in other parts of the world. And their voice is so influential, partly because they are communicating an ethical clarion call. They're essentially visibilizing deep forms of injustice that a lot of people in the West are living with. And so my sense is that when China likely surpasses US imperial power, it will be Chinese citizens themselves that will probably want to dismantle it eventually, just in the same way that the US has been actively protesting against US imperial policies. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the US wants to ban TikTok, because so many people in the US are actively against its policies, are actively against the hugely unpopular wars that it's continuing to play out. And it's really compromising the current, you know, presidential election, right? It's making both potential candidates wildly unpopular. So I think ultimately the future is aligned with these indigenous peoples movements, because Americans have begun to see just how dispossessed they are. In the US, we don't have very good health care, we don't have very good housing or education unless you're very, very wealthy. We have very few things that other first world countries do, but we still like to pretend that we are exceptional, right? We still pretend that we live in American exceptionalism. Everyday people don't experience that. And so I think it will be its own citizens, both US and China, aligning with the global South, essentially. These people's movements, whether it's mass strikes, whether it's building other forms of states, building other forms of subversive communities, they will build, I think, a new future for us. Yeah. And in terms of Tibetans, I think it's so complicated, because I know that for Tibetans living transnationally, you have been living under the middle way policy. Some people are supportive, some are less so. And the fear is what will happen when His Holiness passes, right? And I think ultimately it's up to the Tibetan people to decide where they will put their alignments with people's movements. And I think those living in diaspora in the US and Canada have been making more alignments with Indigenous people's movements. And I think that will grow. Yeah.
I was reading some of your interviews before I came here,
Mm-hmm.
and in your interview with the Bistro Global,
Mm-hmm.
like your presentation here, you said Dharma, a lot of people start practicing using Dharma as a deep tool.
Yes.
So, especially in terms of healing from all the historical traumas and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
personally, in my own life and observation over the years, I've said that a few times to my friends. When we catch and talk about our parents and how their worldview and how they, take things, especially in a settlement, very specific location, right?
Mm-hmm.
But over the years, I've started to think that maybe when religion is used this, when it's practiced,
Mm-hmm.
that's, depending on the level of practice, your
Yeah.
understanding of it, how much of it is just fate and just a way for you to cope because that's the only thing we know.
Yeah.
And if I wonder if that comes in a way of you, cognitively processing the historical trauma or accessing knowledge system out there that the colonizer practices, right? For you to dismantle it instead of being assimilated. And I think it is specific to the Tibetans in the settlements that I'm from it, at least, in terms of how we do not have, all of us didn't get the same level of access to education, especially the previous generation. In the case of my parents and elderly Tibetans. So I wonder if that if it's a way to suppress all of the traumas.
It could be.
Yeah, because they do not. Because for colonized people in a settlement, I see that we have all this poverty of information, right?
Yeah.
And inability to experience a lot of things, inability to imagine a lot of things. So you do not necessarily, for a woman in 50s and 60s in settlement, have a political life or a creative life. And for a human being, for comprehensive well-being, we need spiritual, emotional, financial, creative, all of that, right? So I wonder if that sometimes it could be silences instead of empowering.
Yeah. I think, religion can be used in so many ways. One of the things that's so complicated about colonialism in the Americas is that it was essentially a project of Christian empire, and still Christian nationalism operates pretty powerfully in the West. But I think a lot of people, because of that experience of feeling abused by institutional religion, I think actually that's why so many Westerners are drawn to Eastern traditions and Buddhism and even Native and Indigenous traditions, because they seem more embodied and less about institutional power and less about coercion. And I think that religion really can be, like you said, depending on your level of practice, depending on your level of understanding of the tradition. What I found for a lot of Tibetans living in the US, they said, we have access to teachers, we have access to teachings and to materials and even time to practice in ways that we would have never had in Tibet. So this is an incredible boon. And it was really helping people deal with trauma, grief, sadness, loss. But I think like anything, whether it's food, shopping, we can use it to suppress too. And my sense is that people, sanghas, can hold one another accountable. They can help support one another, fully process more deeply just the depth of what they're carrying. And ultimately, that's part of what sanghas are there to do too. Support one another's practice, but also help witness and verify. And that's really what the data on historical trauma tells us, that people heal by having their experiences validated, by having them affirmed. In some ways, colonialism was so powerful because it was like this large-scale gaslighting. It told people that they were not experiencing what they were experiencing, right? There's so much propaganda and misinformation. And I think that's what Tibetans experience too. They need the affirmation within their communities that, yes, they did experience what they did, and that it's okay to process it together and share that grief together. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you so much. With this, we come to the end of today's session. And then I would like to thank today's guest speaker for the very insightful presentations. And I particularly wanted to say thank you so much for your very in-depth presentation, which really aligned with our museum's objective or goals. And thank you so much. And thank you all the participants who have come over here